beautiful?
Hello, lovers of the world. This is Sinta speaking. I love Hercule Poirot. He is my favorite literary character, and during this time of year, I always get in the mood of reading Agatha Christie books. I have also been embarking on a particular project where I reread all of the Hercule Poirot books, and last year I made a video that wrapped up about 5 books that I read in more or less a few weeks. And here is another video where I read another 5 Hercule Poirot books. I read Dumb Witness, Cards on the Table, Murder of Roger Ackroyd, Death on the Clouds, and Appointment with Death. At the end, I will rank the 5 books in the order of which I like the most. To be honest, I have read all of these books before or have at least seen an adaptation of it, whether that's the BBC Poirot TV series or an old movie adaptation. Therefore, I hazily remember pretty much all of the culprits in each story. So when I'm doing this project, what I'm mostly looking for is how the rereading experience is. So this is less of a review and more like a brain dump of everything I liked or disliked about each story. This video will feature some dissections or discussions of the characters, my thoughts on the plot, and other features of the book that stood out to me. This video is going to be full of spoilers for each book, so I would not recommend watching this video if you haven't read any of the books that I talk about. However, I will include the timestamps in the description in case you want to watch certain parts of the video or if you want to skip over certain sections. So without further ado, let's get to the first book I read, which is Dumb Witness. So the premise is actually quite similar to Sad Cypress, if you guys remember the story, where there is a rich old woman named Emily Arundel. She sends a letter to Hercule Poirot asking for his help because she suspects that one of her relatives is trying to kill her to get their inheritance quicker. But by the time that Poirot receives the letter and arrives at her town, she has passed away. Poirot is still determined to act in her honor and investigates. The story is centered around Emily Arundel's money and whether or not she meant to leave it to her relatives or to a non-relation. And of course, figuring out who killed her. The murderer turned out to be Emily Arundel's niece, Bella. In this story, we have Captain Hastings as our sidekick, and I have a love-hate relationship when it comes to Captain Hastings as a narrator. While he serves the plot well enough, I still think he's a bit annoying, and he is particularly incurious in this book, which is a bit irritating as a reader because as someone who is obviously not in the story itself and is above the plot, I just kept wanting to shake him and say, "Sir, you're in a murder mystery book. Of course there was foul play. Stop trying to deter Poirot." But of course he himself doesn't know that. He's just acting according to his character. I actually much prefer Hastings in the BBC TV show than as a book character / narrator. He is a lot more charming on screen, especially when I'm not in his head the whole time. Honestly, there wasn't much in this book that I enjoyed. I have never really been a fan of these kinds of murder mysteries set in a sleepy English village. It's the whole reason why I gravitate towards Poirot and less so to Miss Marple. And a lot of critics have pointed out that this setting is actually a lot more like her specialty. And ultimately, I just think that these kinds of mysteries set in a village where Poirot has to rely on gossip aren't entertaining or, dare I even say, believable for me. I kind of had the same qualms with Mrs. McGinty's Dead. I think the fact that Poirot had to lie so much to investigate in the story kind of highlights why it wasn't believable, because it's just so hard to believe that these villagers would willingly share so much about one of their own family to an outsider, this foreigner poking his nose in other people's business. In Mrs. McGinty's Dead, Poirot uses a very different method of extracting information, which is that he basically announces to literally everyone right away that he is investigating a death. And I do think it's quite interesting the different approaches he has in the 2 books. Maybe it has something to do with the kind of person who has died. In Dumb Witness, Emily Arundel is old, she's wealthy, and she's very established in the village community, whereas Mrs. McGinty is an elderly cleaning lady. So I argue that the class or the status of the victim definitely defined or dictated how Poirot approached the crimes that are otherwise, in terms of investigation settings, are quite similar to each other. Overall, I was surprised by how bored I was in this book. I expected to enjoy something about the book that maybe I couldn't remember, like the prose or certain conversations and interactions or certain scenes, but there was just nothing. And I remember not being very sold on the solution the first time I read it anyway, and I'm not sold on it the second time either. While the clues are well placed enough, I feel like I just wanted more. I think Christie just chose the suspect that was least likely to do it, decided to pick her for the lols. As a second-time reader, I was actively looking for clues that pointed to Bella Tanios as the culprit, and the text was really heavy-handed with the suspicions on her husband, Jacob Tanios, instead. And so I also kept looking for clues. However, I found none on both accounts. The usual period-typical xenophobia is definitely present, and it extends further to Jacob Tanios, who is Greek, and I just think that that was a very cheap trick to divert suspicions on the reader. So ultimately, the only two things that I did enjoy about the book were Teresa and Dr. Rex Donaldson as a couple. I kind of wish we had more of their interactions in the book. And it's just very amusing to me that those two very different people would get engaged. And I also thought Bob the dog was quite cute. And because of how disappointed I was with this book, I had really high expectations for the next book that I read, which was Cards on the Table. The book opens with a banger of an opening page. Hercule Poirot is conversing with Mr. Shaitana, a shady but rich gentleman who boasts about his collection of murderers and invites Poirot to see them. The readers are immediately foisted into the dinner party, and we meet an excellent new cast of characters. We meet Mr. Shaitana's 4 killers, but we also see he has invited 4 sleuths, including Poirot. This is the first time that we meet Ariadne Oliver. I love her the most out of Agatha Christie's sleuths for Poirot. Ariadne Oliver is a very famous mystery writer, and it's just so interesting to see Agatha Christie's first attempts at the meta commentary of self-inserting herself into her plots, such as Ariadne Oliver revealing that she wrote the same plot in 2 books, which Christie herself has definitely done. To quote from Murder on the Links, "Man is an unoriginal creature." Ariadne also has great chemistry and banter with the other sleuths, which makes everything fun. So the dinner party goes pretty well, and then the 2 parties separate to play a game of bridge, with the 4 killers in one room with Mr. Shaitana and the 4 sleuths in the other room playing bridge as well. When the 2 parties converge again at the end of the evening, it is revealed that Mr. Shaitana has died while stuck in the same room with the other 4 killers. And it is up to basically the 4 sleuths to discuss the possibilities and discover who the killer is. And of course, Poirot does that, but not without other very interesting plot stuff happening in between. The murderer is the Dr. Jeffrey Roberts. What's very interesting is that by the end of the novel, 2 out of the 4 murderers have actually died, with Major Despot being the only one who seems innocent, whereas Mrs. Lorimer is killed by Dr. Roberts and Marathon drowning because she was trying to drown Rhoda, her best friend. And then Dr. Roberts is, of course, the killer himself. I like this book a lot, but there's obviously some really interesting features of the book. There's the usual period-typical homophobia and racism with Mr. Shaitana. Like, we as the reader are very aware that our Mr. Poirot is a foreigner, and we are never not reminded of how others feel and think about him. But when we come across somebody who is more foreign, it's definitely noticeable how Christie portrays and depicts them. I usually point out xenophobia because the English people in her books react to European foreigners like Greek, French, Belgian, Russian, etc. So to the English, they are still white but very different. But with Mr. Shaitana, it's kind of clear that he is not European at all, and so to me it reads a lot more like racism, and that's kind of just how I differentiate xenophobia versus racism. Mr. Shaitana, while not given a specific ethnicity, is definitely brown and definitely other. Throughout the Christie books that I've read, people's qualms about foreigners have always been about how they are different, suspicious, untrustworthy, very different to the English way, etc. But this is kind of the first situation where I feel like Christie has really solidified this idea of evil being associated with a particular race. The language that she uses in the text is definitely different, saying that Mr. Shaitana has got this oriental mind, whatever that means. Edward Said, you will always be famous. It's also interesting that this is directed not at a killer, but instead the victim of the murder mystery. So Poirot pursues this mystery with the same energy and tenacity as he does with his other white victims, as if Christie is saying that even us brown evil individuals deserve justice too. So thanks for that, I guess. So back to the book. If you like the card game Bridge, you should definitely read this book. Bridge is used as a key to solving the mystery, which I just found very compelling. Poirot deduces that the bridge playing habits of the suspects are reflections of their personality, their psychology, and it exposes what each character values. For someone who claims they don't play a lot of bridge, Poirot seems to know the rules very well. And for me, as someone who doesn't know how to play bridge, those sections can be quite confusing. Thankfully, it's not carried throughout the book because otherwise that would have been super more confusing. If I had known the bridge rules before reading the book, that probably would have changed my experience of reading it, but as such, I found it still very compelling but unobtrusive to the reading experience. The book also features Superintendent Battle, one of Christie's recurring characters. It's cool to see his methods contrasted with Poirot's method, that they yield different fruit in different ways. The book also has one of the best displays of Poirot's interrogating skills. The questions he asks the suspects may seem very silly, but reveal so much of the character of each suspect, such as the memory of the room that they stayed in and what their memories say about what stands out to that person. Whereas Superintendent Battle's methods gather facts and information like what happened and who's who. I really like the mystery because while there are only 4 suspects, it's guaranteed that it was one of them, and they're all interesting enough people that their interactions with Poirot are unique and entertaining, and we also spend a lot of time just marinating with each person. The dialogue is also quite witty and fun. Mrs. Lorimer and Poirot's verbal battle in the latter half of the book with barbed wires was really great, but it did make me feel a lot sadder at how Anne Meredith eventually resorted to murder when Mrs. Lorimer was so resolved to shielding her. I believe in the very real tenderness in Mrs. Lorimer's acts of sacrifice, and I think it was just really sad when Anne Meredith not only tried to commit murder as well, but also that she died, and so it almost felt like Mrs. Lorimer's sacrifice for Anne Meredith to continue living when she has, she's a young woman and she has so much of her life ahead of her. It all just felt kind of like nothing. And then I just wonder whether that's Christie's own judgment about murder being very clear. Like, she very clearly thinks that if you have killed somebody, then you don't deserve to live. It's very interesting, and I'm not really sure how that kind of tracks with the rest of her bibliography. I will probably get to that eventually. I think I would have enjoyed this book a lot more if I didn't just finish Dumb Witness and also Hercule Poirot's Christmas. The character Charles in Dumb Witness was a big suspect in the murder due to his tendency to lie, steal, and to cheat, and is generally seen as a very charming but very shady person. This type of character also exists in Hercule Poirot's Christmas through the character of Harry. In those books, Charles and Harry are explicitly suspected by many people in the book to be the killer because they're just immoral characters. But Poirot always argues that to steal and to lie, etc., are very different crimes than to murder somebody. And so now, instead, we get Anne Meredith, who is a thief, but then she also becomes a murderer, which, I don't know, is fine, I guess, but I just wish that this logic that Christie has introduced in 2 separate books stayed consistent throughout her work, I guess, because I fully expected Anne Meredith to not be the killer even after it was revealed that she was the thief because of this logic that was already introduced. And even though the text explicitly showed that how shady she was becoming, how much more ominous she was becoming towards her friend Rhoda, I still, right up to the very moment that she died, I still couldn't believe that she tried to kill Rhoda. And because of that, I don't think I was as entertained entertained or intrigued by the relationship between Major Despot and Rhoda as I would have been if I didn't have this frustration with the inconsistent logic. But in the grand scheme of things, it does make sense for Rhoda and Major Despot to be together because Rhoda is a lot more active and a lot more vibrant than Anne Meredith is, even though Anne Meredith is a lot more beautiful than Rhoda. To be honest, the reveal of Dr. Roberts to be the killer did come out of nowhere for me because I think we just spent so much time entangled in the other three murderers that we sort of forget that, like, oh, that's right, we have to remember Mr. Shaitana's original killer. But you know what? Sure, what the hell not? I definitely would put this up with one of Christie's better works. I don't know if it's like a personal favorite of mine, but this is definitely one of her higher quality texts. And speaking of high quality works, I was really excited for the next book because it has received so many amazing reviews. And even though I have already read it before, I was still excited to read The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. So I know I gave a warning in the beginning of this video to not watch the video if you haven't already read because of spoilers. But again, I have to reiterate, do not watch this section in particular if you haven't read the book. This is one of those endings where you have to experience it yourself without any spoilers at all. Hercule Poirot has retired to a sleepy English village. He lives next door to Dr. James Shepherd, who is friends with our titular Roger Ackroyd. Roger Ackroyd's love interest commits suicide, and he is very anxious to find out why. Roger Ackroyd suspects that his love interest has been blackmailed by somebody and therefore committed suicide to end her suffering. He calls in his good friend Dr. James Shepherd for advice, and in that same evening after they talk, Roger Ackroyd is murdered. Spoiler alert, the murderer is James Shepherd. There's a lot of other things that happen in between, but like that's kind of what the most important thing is when I go on to talk about my other thoughts about the book. We have spent the entire book in the mind of Dr. James Shepherd, and I really applaud the way Christie's construction and framing of the murder happens so that you don't know who the killer is, but there are so many instances that are not explained, withheld from the reader so that suspicion doesn't fall on the narrator. I think the key is that so many mysteries are happening all at once that obfuscates the actual original story almost. It's kind of like what happened with Cards on the Table, where so many things kind of happen to different people that you're like, oh wait, that's right, we were trying to figure out who this guy was. The misdirection of where Ralph went takes up a lot of your brain space throughout the text, but depending on what kind of reader you are, perhaps you'll feel bamboozled by the reveal that it was Dr. Shepherd who had hidden him. I don't think the text gave enough hints that the doctor hid Ralph, which to me runs the risk of almost making him be the person to hide Ralph and be the murderer, kind of like a deus ex machina, which again, it's up to you whether you like or dislike it or not. For me, I'm not really satisfied by it because of that deus ex machina feel, but I want to let it slide because of how ingenious the concept is. And I also wanted to know why it was that Ralph was being hid for so long. I kind of assumed it was because Dr. Shepherd wanted to keep him as far away for as long as possible to make him even more suspicious than he already was, and therefore divert attention away from Dr. Shepherd, which I think is the point. The journey is very nice and very twisty, very entertaining, lots of well-placed clues, and the ending is great. I sometimes wonder though, would Dr. James Shepherd have been brave enough to kill if he had known that there was a very great detective next door? I guess we will never know. It was after a couple of days of finishing the book that I actually realized that Dr. James Shepherd was never really the Watson of the story. He was very involved in the story for sure because he was the doctor that, people kept calling for and was just very involved with the family anyway. As for if we're talking about the person or the individual that Poirot takes into his confidence and relies on for information, it would actually be Dr. Shepherd's sister, Carol, because Carol is the one who's always supplying Poirot with information and always the one reaching out to Poirot for like, oh, what's happened? Or did you hear? Da 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 da. And I imagine that Poirot purposefully took Caroline Shepherd into his confidence instead of James because he had always suspected that James Shepherd was involved with the murder in some way, whereas Carol, there really isn't any particular reason why she would have any investment in the story aside from her natural curiosity and the fact that she just wants to learn the truth. And that's the kind of person that Poirot needs as an assistant Watson. Overall, very worth the hype, very good. And oh, hold on. Why didn't I show this to you earlier? I'm so silly. I don't know why I haven't shown this to you earlier, but I have a very wonderful facsimile copy of Murder of Roger Ackroyd. I love this copy so much. And then I moved on to the next book I read, which was Death on the Clouds. So this murder is set in an airplane, hence the title. Our victim was Madame Giselle, a very successful blackmailing moneylender, and she appears to have been killed by a wasp sting while the plane was in the air. Therefore, our killer could have only have been one of her other fellow passengers. Lots of things happen in the book, as they tend to do, but the two other passengers, Norman Gale, a dentist, and Jane Grey, a hairdresser on holiday, become Poirot's assistants. Poirot investigates a lot of the other passengers, but it eventually revealed that Norman Gale was the murderer. I think this is one of Christie's better works, like an A-tier level book, but it's not a personal favorite of mine. It's definitely entertaining enough, and it honestly has the same surprise twist as Murder of Roger Ackroyd when you think about it, in the sense that one of the Watsons Poirot seems to have been relying on this whole time being revealed to be the murderer. Similarly to Dr. James Shepherd, this sort of just felt very serendipitous in the sense that Norman Gale became an assistant because he had fallen in love with Jane Grey during their time in the airplane, and so because he was cozying up to her and then she was cozying up to Poirot, I think it made more sense for Norman to also stay close to Poirot so that he understands how the investigation is going. But there are definitely well-placed clues, such as this quote that Norman says from the beginning, "When I commit a murder," because shouldn't he say if he commits a murder, not when? When I was reading it for this project, I immediately was like, did everyone else get that? Since he is a Watson, we do spend a little bit of time in his head, but very much like James Shepherd, his mind is basically an impenetrable wall. And this is definitely one of Agatha Christie's better reveals, because I'll read you this quote where Poirot is having his parlor scene. "When did you stop pitching me as the murderer?" said Norman. Poirot wheeled around on him. "I never stopped. You are the murderer." Whoa. Yup. She gagged me with that. Yup. That was a big reveal. That was good. I think the other characters on the plane were interesting too. There's this love triangle between Venetia Kerr, Cecily Horbury, and the husband. There's this love triangle between Jane Grey, Norman Gale, and Jean Dupont, which I think Agatha Christie just made so that Jane wouldn't be so heartbroken when it was revealed that Norman was the killer. I mean, it's a perfectly serviceable romance. I think there could have been a little bit more chemistry in there, but I do like that Poirot kind of gives her this opportunity to travel with the Duponts on archaeological digs as a consolation prize for the fact that Norman Gale was the murderer. And I think, you know what? Good for her. It's what she deserves. I also really like Daniel Clancy as a mystery writer who kind of acts like a proto-Ariadne Oliver. I think as a book, I would recommend this to other people, but it's, again, not a personal favorite of mine. No particular emotional attachment to this. Unlike the next book that I read, which was Appointment with Death. This book is set in an archaeological dig. I believe, honestly, takes place directly after Death on the Nile because Poirot is still in the Middle East and he's still on that holiday. When I first read this as a teenager, my tastes for murder mystery was vastly different to what I have now. I remember not liking this very much and was actually quite impatient with the book. Now, reading this as an adult, this has to be one of my top 5 favorite Agatha Christie books for sure. This book is a behemoth. There's so many ways to untangle this that I definitely do not have time for in this video. So do not be surprised if later down the line I have an entire video dedicated to just this book. Appointment with Death was published in 1938, and later that year, Hercule Poirot's Christmas was also published. So both books are about dysfunctional and abused families, with Appointment with Death about an abusive matriarch and Hercule Poirot's Christmas about an abusive patriarch, Simeon Lee, whom I've talked about in my previous video. So I'm sure an Agatha Christie biographer would be able to pinpoint exactly what motivated Christie to write about this idea of a very abused family in this time of her life, but I guess it goes without saying that this concept of a tortured and unhappy family was definitely on her mind for whatever reason that might have been. Christie also wrote Crooked House in the 1940s, so a few years later. This story features the American Boynton family on a holiday in the Middle East. Poirot overhears the brother and sister Carol and Raymond exclaim that they must kill their stepmother, Mrs. Boynton, because of how much she is ruining their life. So Mrs. Boynton used to be a prison warden before she got married, which supposedly explains why she exerts control over her family the way that she does. And most of the story is actually narrated by Dr. Sarah King, who is also on a holiday and has become very attracted to Raymond Boynton as they ran into each other in their travels. Sarah continues to entangle herself in this family until eventually Mrs. Boynton is murdered and people suspect one of the families. The murderer turned out to not actually be one of the family members, but was Lady Westholme, who had been a prisoner at one of Mrs. Boynton's prisons before Lady Westholme had escaped. Mrs. Boynton had known that immediately that Lady Westholme was one of her ex-prisoners and was going to blackmail her, I guess, and Lady Westholme killed Mrs. Boynton to keep her secret a secret. So this plot is really interesting to me because there is a very long build-up culminating in the murder. It contributes to the confusion, especially since there isn't anyone in the main cast that is in Poirot's confidence. So while the rest of the family are running around like headless chickens during the investigation, I think Poirot really didn't need that much time to deduce or uncover the truth because the events of the story basically take place over a period of like days. This is definitely the most logic-centered story of Agatha Christie's that I've seen, because it relies on catching other people's lies and whether or not it aligns with their actions. So it's a matter of retracing steps, like more so than anything else. And this has to be one of the most insane reading experiences I've ever had with Agatha Christie. It's up there with like Death on the Nile and Murder in Mesopotamia. Like, it is just a beautiful book. I really didn't expect it to like it this much because I remembered it to not be a book that I enjoyed when I was a teenager. So when I read it again, I was kind of like shook very much. And I ended up just rereading it immediately after because I needed to like really digest what I just experienced. So yeah. And now that that's out of the way, I'm going to move on to the observations that I have overall of the 5 books that I read. So if you'll remember, the last batch of books I read, we had 2 young and very amiable doctors, Dr. Stirlingfleet in Third Girl and Dr. Lord in Sad Cypress. And I kind of pointed out how this is a very common trope that Agatha Christie likes to use, a very charming young doctor that is involved in the plot in some way. While Dr. Stirlingfleet and Dr. Lord were allies in Poirot's journey to finding out the truth, in this batch of books, the doctors have become our enemies. So with Dr. Shepherd in Murder of Roger Ackroyd, Dr. Roberts in Cards on the Table, and Norman Gale in Death in the Clouds, though he's still technically a dentist, I'm still counting him, we've come to kind of realize that doctors, while they are our saviors, they can also be quite dangerous. I guess Agatha Christie is at least aware of the breadth of a doctor's mind and capabilities. They can be caring, compassionate, knowledgeable, practical, and hardworking. They are our healers. They value life and good health, which lends them very well to be a good ally for a detective on the hunt for someone who is actively trying to end other people's lives, who is actively trying to make other people's lives worse. On the other hand, Christie also utilizes this fear and anxiety that people have about doctors and hospitals. Lots of people are very scared of going to the clinic or the doctor, and it's not really something that a lot of people look forward to because we understand on some deep level that we are placing our lives and our well-being in the hands of strangers. And we know that, ironically, doctors actually are very knowledgeable on how to extinguish life, since so much of their career revolves around keeping it going instead. So she uses that fear in her favor and subverts this idea of doctors only being healers and instead actually being very, very dangerous and someone that you can't trust. Of course, this idea is further interrogated in Appointment with Death, where we not only have one doctor, but 2 who have very different opinions about death and the importance of human life. Sarah spends a lot of time ruminating about religion. She feels a lot of disgust over this concept of evil and how that manifests through cruel control over human beings. And this is interesting because Sarah, as a doctor, does have control over human life in her own way. And this repulsion she feels for Mrs. Boynton is likely a result of a doctor's desire for people to live and to live well. So circling back to what I said about doctors being dangerous, I really do think that I could see Sarah killing someone even without being in love with Raymond, and that's just based entirely on her personality, which definitely justifies why Poirot suspected her in the first place and why she is not taken into his confidence in the same way that maybe Captain Hastings or even Jane Grey was. I do think it's interesting that there are 2 books where the Watsons have turned out to be the culprit, with Dr. Shepherd in Murder of Roger Ackroyd and Norman Gale in Death in the Clouds. So now I want to go rank the 5 books that I read. This is just within the 5 that I read and not overall. I think I'll reserve that for another video. So the book that I liked the least is Dumb Witness. I just didn't like the ending. Then the book after that, I liked Death in the Clouds. It was just very straightforward and very neatly executed. And then I would say that I like The Murder of Roger Ackroyd and Cards on the Table equally. So they're in second place, basically. They're sharing that. I couldn't decide between the 2 of them because they are so good for completely different reasons, and the flaws that each book has are so different to each other. Cards on the Table is just immensely entertaining. There's lots of funny moments, but when it gets dark, it gets very dark. Murder of Roger Ackroyd is just bonkers for real. The fact that this was written so early in Agatha Christie's career is insane. I can't believe she just came up with that. And then the book that I liked out of the 5 for sure is Appointment with Death. As I said earlier, it is one of my favorite Agatha Christie books for sure. And so that concludes my thoughts on the books. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button. Let me know in the comments your thoughts on the books or how they fit into your own personal ranking of Agatha Christie books. If you want to see more of my work, subscribe. I post videos about music, books, and films. All of my social media links are down in the description, alongside my Ko-fi and Patreon page if you want to support my work. I look forward to sharing my love with you next time. I'll see you soon. Bye! This knows the wicked lies are lonely for the rest of my life, and I want nothing else to lie.